What drives people to risk everything for others? During the Second World War, millions were trapped. They were prisoners of war, civilians caught behind enemy lines, or people targeted by their own governments. The odds of survival were often slim. The chances of rescue were even slimmer. Yet, time and again, small groups of people decided to try. They planned missions that seemed impossible. They faced overwhelming enemy numbers, impossible terrain, and the simple, crushing reality of time running out. Why did a team of commandos agree to crash a ship full of explosives into a dock? How did a single diplomat, armed only with a pen and a stamp, save thousands of lives? What made ordinary citizens hide down pilots in their attics, knowing that a single mistake meant death for their entire family? These weren't just stories of soldiers, they were stories of nurses, diplomats, factory owners, and resistance fighters. They were stories about people who saw a terrible situation and refused to accept it. They chose to act. This is a look at 18 of those stories. 18 times when the plan was crazy, the danger was absolute, and somehow, against all odds, they succeeded. Number 18, how did they steal a submarine from the bottom of the ocean? The German U-boat U-505 was a menace in the Atlantic. It had sunk 8 Allied ships, but by 1944, its luck was running out. On June 4th, 1944, a U.S. Navy task group led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal found it. The group was part of Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer unit specifically designed to track and destroy these undersea threats. The commander of the group was Captain Daniel V. Gallery. He had a radical idea. For years, the Allies had been sinking U-boats. But Gallery didn't want to sink this one. He wanted to capture it. The plan was a long shot. No one had captured an enemy submarine on the high seas since the 19th century. The standard procedure for a U-boat crew under attack was to scuttle the vessel. They would open sea valves and set demolition charges to ensure their technology and codebooks never fell into enemy hands. Gallery knew this. He briefed his men on a plan that sounded like something from a movie. If they forced a U-boat to the surface, a boarding party would leap onto its deck, find the valves, and disarm the charges before it could sink. When U-505 was damaged by depth charges and forced to surface, the plan went into motion. The German crew began to abandon ship, believing it was sinking. A boarding party led by Lieutenant Albert David from the USS Pillsbury raced towards the sub. The U-boat was circling, its rudder jammed, and water was pouring into it. David and his team climbed aboard the still-moving vessel. They had no idea if demolition charges were about to go off. They didn't know if any German crewmen were still below, waiting to fight back. Inside, they found chaos. Water was flooding the control room. They found the main sea strainer, a large valve designed to flood the boat, and managed to close it. A book by Gallery himself, 20 Million Tons Under the Sea, details the desperate search for the scuttling charges. The team's engineer, Chief Engineman's Mateson on Lucosius, found them, timed to detonate in minutes, and disarmed them. Meanwhile, the boarding party gathered every book, chart, and piece of paper they could find. They found the Enigma coding machines and the code books for the next 2 months. This intelligence was priceless. The sailors managed to get the U-505 under control. They attached a tow line, and the slow, difficult process of towing it thousands of miles back to Bermuda began. The crew of the U-505, now prisoners, were rescued from the water. Captain Gallery had to keep the capture a complete secret. If the German High Command knew the sub and its codes were in Allied hands, they would change them immediately, rendering the intelligence useless. The German sailors were sent to a special prisoner of war camp in Louisiana, kept isolated from everyone. The Red Cross was not notified. The Navy even faked a report that the U-505 had been sunk. The intelligence gathered from U-505 was immensely valuable, helping to direct Allied shipping away from U-boat patrol areas for the rest of the war. The submarine itself survived and is now an exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. It was a rescue of a different kind. It wasn't about saving a life, but about saving a priceless piece of enemy technology and intelligence, a mission that succeeded through sheer audacity. But what codes were found on U-505 that remain classified to this day were their other attempts to capture U-boats that ended in failure and were never spoken of again. And what happened to the individual German sailors who were held incommunicado, their families believing them dead for over a year. Number 17, how do you save the people who are trying to sink you? The Atlantic Ocean in 1942 was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. On September 12th, the British troop ship RMS Laconia was sailing off the coast of West Africa. It was carrying around 2,732 people. This included British soldiers, civilians, women, children, and a large number of Italian prisoners of war. The German submarine U-156, commanded by Werner Hartenstein, spotted it. Following his orders, Hartenstein fired 2 torpedoes. The Laconia was hit and began to sink. As the ship went down, Hartenstein surfaced his submarine. He expected to see enemy soldiers. Instead, he saw hundreds of people struggling in the water, many of them speaking Italian, Germany's allies. The book The Laconia Affair by Leonce Pellard documents what happened next. Hartenstein made a decision that defied his orders and the brutal logic of war. He decided to rescue the survivors. His submarine was small. It could only hold a few dozen people. He surfaced and began pulling people from the water, prioritizing the women and children. He took on nearly 200 survivors, cramming them inside the boat and lashing lifeboats to the deck. His U-boat was now dangerously overloaded and unable to dive. And Hartenstein then did something even more astonishing. He broadcast an uncoded radio message in plain English and French to all ships in the area. He gave his position and requested assistance with the rescue, promising not to attack any ship that came to help. He even draped a large Red Cross flag over his submarine's deck. Another German submarine, U-506, arrived to help along with an Italian submarine. The Vichy French authorities in nearby Dakar dispatched ships to assist. For a few days, a strange truce existed in this small patch of ocean. German and Italian submarines were working to save the lives of British and Polish civilians and soldiers. Then, on September 16th, an American B-24 Liberator bomber, flying from a secret airbase on Ascension Island, appeared overhead. The pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, saw the U-boat with a Red Cross flag and lifeboats full of people. He radioed his base for instructions. The duty officer, Captain Robert C. Richardson III, gave a blunt order: sink the sub. Richardson later stated he believed the Red Cross flag was a trick. Harden's bomber attacked. Bombs fell among the lifeboats and straddled the U-boat. Hartenstein was forced to order the survivors on his deck back into the water and prepare to dive to save his own vessel. The lifeboats he was towing were cast adrift. The U-156 was damaged but managed to escape. The brief humanitarian truce was over. The French ships eventually arrived and picked up many of the remaining survivors, but hundreds who might have been saved were lost due to the attack. The incident had a lasting impact. The head of the German Navy, Karl Donitz, issued the Laconia Order. It strictly forbade U-boat commanders from ever attempting to rescue survivors again. From that point on, they were to surface, confirm the sinking, and leave. The rescue attempt was a fleeting moment of shared humanity in the middle of a brutal conflict. It was a mission that started successfully, with enemies cooperating, only to be shattered by the rigid rules of war. It succeeded in saving hundreds, but it could have saved so many more. But what were the exact contents of the initial radio transmissions between the American pilot and his base commander? Did the pilot protest his orders in any way? And how did the Italian prisoners of war who were rescued by the Germans describe their experience, and were their accounts ever officially recorded by Allied authorities? Number 16, can you rescue a king while his country is falling? In April 1940, the war came to Norway. German forces launched a surprise invasion, Operation Weserübung. Their primary goals were to secure naval bases and the transport routes for Swedish iron ore. A key part of their plan was to capture the Norwegian government and the royal family in Oslo, forcing a quick surrender. But things didn't go according to plan. King Haakon VII, his son Crown Prince Olav, and the Norwegian government were alerted just in time. As German ships entered the Oslofjord, the Norwegian coastal defenses at Oscarsborg Fortress opened fire, sinking the heavy cruiser Blucher. This single act of defiance, detailed in the book The King's Choice by Alfar Jacobsen, delayed the German landing in Oslo by several crucial hours. It gave the royal family and the government just enough time to escape the capital by train. What followed was not a single rescue mission, but a desperate, 2-month-long fighting retreat across Norway. The king became the symbol of Norwegian resistance. His refusal to surrender, broadcast to the people, galvanized the nation. The mission to save him was also the mission to save Norway's legitimacy as a free country. He was constantly on the move, hunted by German air power and special units. The rescue was a chaotic, improvised affair. The royal family and government officials traveled by train, car, and boat, always just one step ahead of the advancing enemy. They sought shelter in small towns and farmhouses. At one point, near the village of Nybergsund, they were discovered by German aircraft. They fled into the snowy woods just as the village was bombed. The king and his son took shelter under a birch tree, an image that became an iconic photograph of Norway's struggle. British and French forces had landed in Norway to help, but they were outmaneuvered and poorly equipped for the campaign. The rescue of the king depended on a small group of loyal Norwegian soldiers and politicians. It also depended on another equally important mission rescuing Norway's gold reserves. Over 50 tons of gold were secretly loaded onto trucks and trains and began a parallel journey north, away from the Germans. This gold would fund the Norwegian government in exile for the entire war. By early June, the Allied position in Norway had become untenable. The battle for France was going badly, and the troops were needed elsewhere. The decision was made to evacuate. On June 7th, 1940, King Haakon, the royal family, and key government members boarded the British heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire at the port of Tromsø. For 3 days, the ship sailed through treacherous waters, avoiding U-boats and enemy aircraft to reach safety in Britain. The king would establish a government in exile in London, continuing to inspire the Norwegian resistance via BBC radio broadcasts for the next 5 years. The mission was a success against staggering odds. It was a rescue conducted on the fly, with no central plan across hundreds of miles of war-torn country. It saved not just a man, but the symbol of a nation's will to fight. But who was the informant that nearly led the Germans to the king's hiding place at Nybergsund? How many of the civilian drivers and local guides who helped transport the gold reserve were ever officially recognized for their bravery? And were there secret contingency plans to get the king to neutral Sweden if the sea evacuation had failed? Number 15, how do you save men from a sunken ship when no one knows where you are? The story of the USS Indianapolis is one of the most tragic in U.S. naval history. On July 30th, 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, the heavy cruiser was sailing alone in the Philippine Sea. It had just completed a top-secret mission delivering key components of the atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. Its mission was so secret that its route was not widely known, and it was sailing without an escort. Just after midnight, it was struck by 2 torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-58. The damage was catastrophic. The ship sank in just 12 minutes. Of the 1,195 crewmen on board, about 900 made it into the water. Their ordeal was just beginning. Because of communication errors and the secrecy of the ship's mission, no one reported it overdue. For nearly 4 days, the survivors floated in the open ocean. They had few life rafts and not enough life jackets. The sun was scorching during the day, and the water was cold at night. They were dehydrated, starving, and suffering from saltwater poisoning. And then the sharks came. The sinking of the Indianapolis resulted in one of the worst shark attacks on humans ever recorded. The rescue, when it finally came, was a complete accident. On the 4th day, a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol, flown by Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn, happened to fly over the area. He saw a massive oil slick and, looking closer, saw the heads of men bobbing in the water. He immediately dropped a life raft and a radio transmitter and reported his position. The rescue effort that followed was immense and desperate. Another pilot, Lieutenant Adrian Marks, flying a PBY Catalina flying boat, arrived on the scene. Seeing the men being attacked by sharks, he disobeyed standing orders not to land in the open ocean. He brought his large plane down on the rough seas, the impacts damaging the aircraft. His crew began pulling the exhausted, oil-covered survivors from the water. They crammed over 50 men inside the plane's hull and tied others to the wings with parachute cord. As night fell, the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle, guided to the scene by Gwynn's report, arrived. Captain W. Graham Claytor ordered his ship's searchlights to be turned on, aimed straight up into the sky. This was a massive risk. The light could attract Japanese submarines, but it gave the, scattered groups of survivors a beacon of hope to swim towards. Over the next few days, more ships arrived. Of the 900 men who went into the water, only 316 were rescued. The rescue mission itself, once initiated, was a success. It was a story of individual pilots and captains making brave choices, risking their own lives and equipment to save the men in the water. But it was a rescue that almost didn't happen. It hinged on the chance sighting by a single pilot, the subsequent controversy over why the ship was not missed, and the court-martial of its captain, Charles B. McVay III, would haunt the Navy for decades. The book In Harm's Way by Doug Stanton provides a harrowing account of the entire ordeal. Why was a specific request for a destroyer escort for the Indianapolis denied by the operations officer in Guam? What happened to the logbooks that might have shown who knew about the ship's sailing schedule and failed to track it? And were there other ships sunk in the final days of the war whose disappearances were never fully investigated due to the chaos of the time? Number 14, what makes someone betray their country to save the enemy? This is a strange kind of rescue. It wasn't about saving your own people. It was about saving your sworn enemy. The man at the center of it was Oskar Schindler. He was a member of the German political party, an ethnic German from Czechoslovakia, a businessman and a spy. By all accounts, he was an opportunist who went to Poland in 1939 to profit from the war. He took over a confiscated enamelware factory in Krakow, a factory that had previously been Jewish-owned. He was, in short, the kind of man who seemed perfectly positioned to benefit from the new order in Europe. But something changed. Schindler ran his factory, Deutsche Immobilienfabrik, using Jewish labor from the nearby Krakow ghetto. At first, it was purely a business decision. Jewish labor was cheap, and his connections with the German administration gave him access to contracts. He was a charismatic man who enjoyed the good life, bribing officials with cognac and luxury goods to keep his factory running smoothly. As the war progressed, the German policy towards the Jewish population became increasingly brutal. Schindler witnessed the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto in March 1943. He saw the violence and the deportations firsthand. This event, according to many survivors, was a turning point for him. His motivation shifted from profit to something else. He began to actively protect his workers. His factory became a haven. The rescue mission was not a single event, but a long, sustained campaign of bribery, deception, and immense personal risk. Schindler, with the help of his accountant Itzhak Stern, began to compile his famous list. As the German forces began to close factories and send the workers to concentration camps, Schindler argued that his workers were essential to the war effort. He claimed his factory was producing artillery shells. This was a lie. The factory produced almost nothing of value to the war effort. He used his entire fortune, everything he had earned, to bribe officials and to buy food and medicine for his workers on the black market. The most critical moment came in late 1944. The Plaszow concentration camp, where his workers were held, was being liquidated. Everyone was scheduled for deportation to Auschwitz. Schindler made his boldest move. He got permission to move his entire factory and all its workers to a new location in Brunlitz, Czechoslovakia. The list of names, the Schindler's List, was the list of the people he claimed were his essential workers. It included over 1,100 men, women, and children. Thomas Keneally's book Schindler's Ark, later published as Schindler's List, chronicles this incredible undertaking. Even this move was not without peril. One train carrying the men on the list was diverted to the Gross-Rosen camp. Another carrying the women was sent to Auschwitz. Schindler had to use all his influence and money to get them out, personally traveling to the camps to bribe the commandants. He succeeded. For the final months of the war, the 1,100 Schindler's Jews worked in his fake munitions factory in Brunlitz, surviving the war under his protection. By the end, he was penniless. What was the true final catalyst that turned Schindler from a war profiteer into a savior? How many other German industrialists secretly tried to protect their workers but failed? Their stories lost to history. And what specific arguments did Schindler use to persuade the notoriously ruthless camp commandant Amon Goth to let his workers live? Number 13, how did one woman organize the rescue of 2,500 children? In the Warsaw Ghetto, over 400,000 Jewish people were confined in a tiny, walled-off section of the city. Conditions were horrific. Starvation and disease were rampant. From this place of utter despair, one of the most remarkable rescue operations of the war was born. It was led by a Polish social worker named Irina Sendler. Sendler was not a soldier or a spy in the traditional sense. She was a senior administrator in the Warsaw Social Welfare Department. This position gave her a special permit to enter the ghetto, officially to inspect the sanitary conditions. She used this access for a different purpose. She was a member of Zagota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, a clandestine resistance organization. Her specific role was to lead its children's section. The mission was to smuggle Jewish children out of the ghetto and find them safe homes with non-Jewish Polish families in convents or in orphanages. It was an operation that required unbelievable courage and meticulous organization. Getting a child out was the first and most dangerous step. As detailed in the book Irina's Children by Tova Feldschuh, Sendler and her network of about 24 volunteers used every method imaginable. They carried babies out in ambulances, hidden under stretchers. They sedated infants and placed them in boxes with air holes, then drove them out with shipments of goods. Some children were guided through the city's sewer system. Others were taken through a secret passage in an old courthouse that had one door inside the ghetto and another on the Aryan side of the city. Once a child was out, the work had just begun. Each child needed a new identity. They were given new, Polish-sounding names and forged identity documents. They were taught Catholic prayers and coached on how to behave so they wouldn't arouse suspicion. Finding families willing to take in a Jewish child was incredibly difficult. In German-occupied Poland, the penalty for helping a Jew was death, not just for the individual but for their entire family. Yet Sendler's network found thousands of brave people who were willing to take that risk. Sendler knew that one day, after the war, these children would need to know their real identities and be reunited with any surviving relatives. So she kept a secret record. On thin strips of paper, she wrote down the original name and the new, assumed name of every child she rescued. And she buried these lists in glass jars under an apple tree in a friend's garden. In October 1943, Sendler was arrested by the Gestapo, the German secret police. They knew she was a key figure in the resistance. She was taken to Pauiak prison and interrogated. Despite being tortured, she refused to reveal the names of her co-conspirators or the locations of the children. She was sentenced to death, but Zagota didn't abandon her. The resistance managed to bribe a guard on the day of her scheduled execution. He listed her as executed on the official reports and let her escape. For the rest of the war, Irina Sendler lived in hiding under a false identity, but she continued her work. In total, Irina Sendler and her network are credited with saving around 2,500 children. Her story was largely unknown for decades after the war, until a group of high school students in Kansas discovered it for a history project in the late 1990s. How many of the families who hid children were betrayed by their neighbors, and what was the true number of Poles executed for this specific act of defiance? What happened to the specific Gestapo officer who took the bribe to let Irina Sendler escape? And how many of the children after the war chose to keep their new identities and never reconnect with their Jewish roots? Number 12. How do you evacuate an entire army using fishing boats? In May 1940, the war in Europe was going disastrously for the Allies. German forces had swept through Belgium and northern France in a lightning campaign. The British Expeditionary Force BEF, along with French and Belgian soldiers, was pushed back to the coast. They were trapped with their backs to the English Channel in a small pocket around the town of Dunkirk. The German army was closing in. It seemed like the entire British army, over 300,000 men, was about to be captured or annihilated. This would have been a blow from which Britain might never have recovered. What was needed was a rescue mission on a almost unimaginable scale. The official plan, codenamed Operation Dynamo, was to use Royal Navy destroyers and other large ships to evacuate the troops from the Dunkirk harbor. But there was a problem. The harbor was under constant air attack and was heavily damaged. The shallow beaches meant that large ships couldn't get close to shore to pick up the men who were waiting there on long, exposed lines. This is when one of the most legendary rescue efforts in history began. The British Admiralty put out a call for help. They asked for any vessel of any size that could cross the channel. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A strange and wonderful flotilla of little ships set sail from the coast of England. There were fishing boats, yachts, lifeboats, ferries, and private pleasure craft. They were crewed by their civilian owners, by fishermen, and by volunteers. Hundreds of these small boats, many of which had never been in the open sea, made the dangerous crossing. The scene at Dunkirk was one of controlled chaos. The soldiers stood in queues stretching from the beaches into the water, waiting patiently while under fire from enemy aircraft. The little ships couldn't carry many men at once, but they could get close to the shore. They acted as ferries, shuttling soldiers from the beaches out to the larger destroyers and transport ships waiting in deeper water. Some of the small boats made the entire journey back to England themselves, packed with exhausted soldiers. The Royal Air Force flew continuous patrols over the area, engaging the German Air Force in furious dogfights to protect the evacuation. The rearguard, mostly French soldiers, fought a series of desperate holding actions, delaying the German advance and buying precious time for the men on the beaches. The evacuation lasted from May 26th to June 4th, 1940. Initially, the British government hoped to rescue maybe 45,000 men. By the time it was over, an astonishing 338,226 Allied soldiers had been saved. The story is powerfully retold in Walter Lord's book, The Miracle of Dunkirk. It was not a victory. The BEF had been defeated and had to leave behind almost all of its heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, and vehicles. But it was a miraculous rescue. It saved the core of the British Army, allowing it to reform, re-equip, and fight another day. It was a mission carried out not just by the military, but by ordinary people in ordinary boats who risked their lives to bring the soldiers home. Why exactly did the German armored divisions halt their advance on Dunkirk for 3 crucial days? A decision that remains a subject of intense historical debate. How many of the civilian little ships were sunk during the operation? And what is the true count of the civilian volunteers who died? Were there any plans for a guerrilla warfare campaign in Britain if the army had been lost at Dunkirk and an invasion had followed? On number 11, how do you rescue an island from starvation? By the summer of 1942, the small island of Malta in the Mediterranean was on the verge of collapse. Malta was a critical British naval and air base. From its airfields, Allied planes could attack enemy supply convoys going from Italy to North Africa. Because of this, the island was subjected to one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. It was, for a time, the most bombed place on Earth. The island was under siege. German and Italian U-boats, aircraft, and surface ships controlled the surrounding sea. Almost no supplies were getting through. The people of Malta and the soldiers defending it were running out of everything: food, fuel, ammunition, and medicine. It was estimated that the island would be forced to surrender by September 1942 if a major supply convoy did not get through. The rescue of Malta was not about saving a group of people, but about saving an entire island population and a vital strategic outpost. The mission was codenamed Operation Pedestal. It was a plan to force a massive, heavily protected convoy through the enemy blockade. The convoy consisted of 14 of the fastest merchant ships available, including the vital American oil tanker SS Ohio, which carried the jet fuel needed for Malta's Spitfire fighter planes. The escort was one of the most powerful naval forces ever assembled by the Royal Navy. It included 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and over 30 destroyers. The convoy set sail from Britain, passed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and entered the Mediterranean on August 10, 1942. The enemy was waiting. For the next 5 days, the convoy was under relentless attack from the air and from the sea. Submarines, torpedo bombers, high-level bombers, and Italian E-boats threw everything they had at the ships. The battle was brutal. The aircraft carrier HMS Eagle was sunk by a U-boat early on. 2 other carriers were damaged. Cruisers and destroyers were hit. One by one, the merchant ships were sunk or crippled. The book Pedestal, The Convoy That Saved Malta by Peter C. Smith details the harrowing journey. The sky was filled with anti-aircraft fire, and the sea was littered with burning ships. The tanker SS Ohio became the focus of the entire operation. It was hit by torpedoes and bombs multiple times. Its engines were knocked out. Its deck was a wreck. Yet, somehow, it refused to sink. At one point, the crew had to abandon ship, but then they reboarded it. The ship was so damaged it was barely afloat. In a final, desperate effort, Two destroyers, HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury, were lashed to either side of the tanker, essentially holding it up, while another destroyer towed it from behind. They literally pushed and pulled the wreck of the Ohio towards Malta. On August 15th, the battered remnants of the convoy limped into Malta's Grand Harbor. Only 5 of the original 14 merchant ships had made it, but among them was the Ohio. The supplies they brought were just enough. The fuel for the planes and the food for the people allowed Malta to hold on. The siege was broken and the island remained in Allied hands. The cost was enormous, with over 400 Allied sailors and airmen losing their lives, but the mission succeeded. It saved the island. What was the full extent of the intelligence failures that led the British to underestimate the strength of the air attacks on the convoy? Were there debates within the German and Italian high commands about launching a full-scale surface fleet attack, and what held them back? How did the civilian dock workers in Malta, themselves starving and under bombardment, manage to unload the damaged ships so quickly? Number 10, can you rescue a whole army one person at a time? During the air war over occupied Europe, thousands of Allied airmen were shot down. If they survived the crash, they found themselves alone deep in enemy territory. For these men, capture meant a prisoner of war camp. But a vast secret network of civilians was determined to offer them another option, a chance to get home. This was the work of the escape lines, and the most famous of them all was the Comet Line. The Comet Line was not a single, static thing. It was a fluid chain of people stretching from Brussels through occupied Belgium and France, across the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, and finally to the British consulate in Bilbao. The mission was to rescue downed airmen and guide them along this perilous route. It was founded in 1941 by a young Belgian woman in her early 20s named Andrée de Jong, known as EDD. She had been a commercial artist before the war. She personally escorted many of the airmen across the mountains. The operation was built on trust and incredible bravery. Each link in the chain was a safe house, a family willing to hide the airmen in their homes, feed them, and provide them with civilian clothes. There were guides who would take the airmen from one safe house to the next, usually traveling by train. The final leg of the journey was the most dangerous, a multi-day trek on foot across the rugged, snow-capped Pyrenees, often in terrible weather, led by experienced Basque smugglers. Everything was done in secret. The airmen were given false identity papers and coached on how to behave. A single mistake speaking English in public, wearing the wrong kind of shoes, a nervous glance at a German patrol could mean disaster for everyone. If a single link in the chain was broken, if one person was captured and talked, the entire network in that area could be compromised. And the risks were absolute. The people who ran the Comet Line were not soldiers. They were teachers, priests, farmers, and housewives. If caught, they faced interrogation, deportation to concentration camps, or immediate execution. The book The Freedom Line by Peter Eisner tells the story of how hundreds of ordinary people became heroes. Over the course of the war, the Comet Line was infiltrated and betrayed multiple times. Many of its key members, including Andrée de Jong herself, were eventually captured. She survived years in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Her father, Frederick de Jong, who was also a key organizer, was executed. Despite the losses, the line always reformed. When one leader was captured, another would step up. When one route was compromised, a new one was found. It was a rescue mission that happened in slow motion over and over again for 4 years. In total, the Comet Line is credited with helping over 700 Allied soldiers and airmen escape back to Britain. Each successful escape was a small victory, a testament to the power of organized civilian resistance. How did the organization maintain its financial records to pay guides and forgers without leaving a paper trail that could be captured? What coded language or signals did they use in everyday correspondence to pass messages, and how many failed escape attempts were there that resulted in the execution of both the airmen and their civilian helpers, stories that were never officially recorded? Number 9, what if an entire nation decided to save its people? In most of occupied Europe, the German authorities were able to implement their policies with terrifying efficiency. But in one country, Denmark, something different happened. In the autumn of 1943, the vast majority of Denmark's Jewish population was saved in a spontaneous nationwide rescue effort. Denmark's situation was unique. When Germany occupied the country in 1940, they allowed the Danish government and King Christian X to remain in place, governing domestic affairs. For several years, this model protectorate meant that Danish Jews were relatively safe compared to those in other countries. But in the late summer of 1943, Danish resistance activities increased, and the German administration decided to crack down. They dissolved the Danish government and planned to round up and deport the country's 8,000 Jews. The roundup was scheduled for the night of October 1st, during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. What happened next was extraordinary. A German diplomat, George Ferdinand Duckwitz, secretly learned of the plan. He leaked the information to Danish politicians. The politicians, in turn, warned the leaders of the Jewish community. The word spread like wildfire. On the night of the planned raids, German police found almost all the apartments and homes of the Jewish population empty. The people had vanished. The rescue was not a centralized military-style operation. It was a massive, spontaneous act of civil disobedience. Ordinary Danish citizens, doctors, taxi drivers, students, fishermen hid their Jewish neighbors in their homes, in hospitals, in churches. The book Countrymen by Bo Lidegaard uses Danish archives to show how a whole society mobilized. University students helped organize hiding places. Hospitals hid people as patients. A network of helpers emerged overnight to move the Jewish families to the coast. The goal was to get them across the Øresund, the narrow strait of water separating Denmark from neutral Sweden. This is where the Danish fishing fleet became the mission's unlikely navy. For several weeks, in hundreds of small fishing boats, fishermen smuggled groups of people across the water, usually at night. They hid their human cargo under fishing nets and equipment. The journey was dangerous. German patrol boats monitored the waters. Some of the fishermen charged exorbitant fees, but many more did it for free, risking their boats and their lives. The Danish resistance helped coordinate the crossings and dealt with informants. By the end of October, more than 7,200 of Denmark's Jews, along with hundreds of their non-Jewish relatives, had been safely transported to Sweden. This was over 90% of the entire population. It was a rescue mission carried out not by a special forces team, but by an entire nation. It succeeded because of a leak from a German official, the quick action of Danish leaders, and the fundamental decency of thousands of ordinary people who refused to stand by and watch their fellow citizens be taken away. Why did George Duckwitz, a German official, risk his career and life to leak the plans for the roundup? What was the true number of Danish fishermen who were caught and punished by the occupying authorities? And were there organized plans within the Swedish government to receive the refugees, or was their response as improvised as the rescue itself? Number 8, how does a diplomat's signature become a weapon? In the summer of 1940, the city of Kaunas, Lithuania, was a bottleneck of desperation. Thousands of refugees, many of them Jewish, had fled from German-occupied Poland into Lithuania. But now Lithuania itself was being annexed by the Soviet Union. The refugees were trapped between two hostile regimes. The foreign consulates were ordered to close. For the people stranded there, every door to escape was slamming shut. Into the situation stepped Chune Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kaunas. He was a mid-level diplomat, not a high-ranking official. He was under direct orders from his government in Tokyo to stop issuing visas. Japan was forming an alliance with Germany, and they did not want to anger their new partner by helping Jewish refugees. But outside his consulate, a crowd of hundreds of desperate people had gathered. They were begging for transit visas through Japan. With a Japanese visa, they could then get permission to travel across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway to the port of Vladivostok. From there, they could take a boat to Japan and then hopefully on to somewhere else in the world. Without the visa, they were trapped. Sugihara was faced with a choice. He could obey his orders, close his consulate, and leave these people to their fate. Or he could defy his government and try to help. He cabled Tokyo 3 times, asking for permission to issue the visas. 3 times he was denied. His instructions were clear: no one gets a visa unless they have proper documentation and a final destination. The refugees had neither. According to his own memoirs, in the book Refuge of the Righteous by Hillel Levine, Sugihara discussed the situation with his wife Yukiko. He decided he could not abandon these people. He chose to disobey his orders. For 29 days, from July 18th to August 16th, 1940, Sugihara and his wife worked around the clock, writing visas by hand. He ignored the official requirements. He wrote visa after visa, often for 18 to 20 hours a day. the consulate was a scene of organized chaos. He simplified the process to get as many done as possible. He wrote until his hands were cramped and sore. Even when he was forced to close the consulate and move to a hotel, the refugees followed him. He kept writing visas. On the day he had to leave Kaunas by train, he was still writing them from his compartment window. As the train began to pull away from the station, he was throwing signed visa papers out of the window to the crowd on the platform. His final words to them were reportedly, "Please forgive me. I cannot write anymore. I wish you the best." It's estimated that Chiune Sugihara issued several thousand visas. Because a single visa could cover an entire family, the number of people he saved is thought to be around 6,000. The Sugihara survivors made the long journey across Siberia to Japan. Many of them later settled in the United States, Canada, and Israel. For his act of defiance, Sugihara was dismissed from the Japanese Foreign Service after the war. He lived in obscurity for years, his story unknown. It was a rescue mission conducted not with guns or boats, but with a pen, a stamp, and an extraordinary act of personal conscience. How many of Sugihara's visas were ultimately rejected by Soviet or Japanese officials at border crossings? Were there other foreign diplomats in Kaunas who were secretly helping him behind the scenes? And what was the full, unredacted content of the cables he exchanged with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and do they reveal more about the internal debate happening in Tokyo? Number 7, how did a group of journalists and artists outsmart a secret police? Marseille, France, in 1940 was a city filled with fear and hope. After the fall of France, the country was divided. The north was under direct German occupation, while the south was governed by the collaborationist Vichy regime. Marseille, a port city in the Vichy zone, became a magnet for thousands of refugees. They were artists, writers, scientists, intellectuals, and political dissidents who had fled the advance of the German army. Now, they were trapped. The Vichy regime was actively hunting them down and handing them over to the German secret police, the Gestapo. An unlikely rescuer arrived in the city in August 1940. His name was Varian Fry. He was an American journalist and editor from New York. He came to France as a representative of the Emergency Rescue Committee, a private American relief organization. His mission was to find about 200 prominent artists and intellectuals on a specific list and help them escape. He had $3,000 taped to his leg and was supposed to be in France for a few weeks. He stayed for 13 months. Fry set up his operation in a hotel room, which quickly became a makeshift clandestine embassy for the desperate. He soon realized that the problem was much bigger than the 200 names on his list. Thousands needed help. He and a small team of fellow expatriates and French volunteers built a sophisticated rescue network from scratch. The story is told in his memoir, Surrender on Demand. The mission was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with the Vichy police and German agents. Fry's team forged identity documents, secured black market currency, and arranged passage on cargo ships. Their most important asset was finding illegal escape routes. The main one was a secret path over the Pyrenees into Spain, a route scouted and guided by the German novelist Hans Saul and the Austrian economist Albert Hirschman, both of whom were refugees themselves. They called it the F-line for Fry. Fry's clients were a who's who of European culture at the time. He helped rescue the painter Marc Chagall, the political scientist Hannah Arendt, the surrealist artist Max Ernst, and the Nobel laureate Otto Meyerhoff, among many others. His operation was an open secret in Marseille. He constantly had to bribe officials, charm his way out of police interrogations, and operate in a legal gray area, all while being monitored by spies. He was a brilliant improviser, using his respectable American identity as a shield while running a completely illegal operation. In September 1941, Fry was finally arrested by the Vichy police and deported back to the United States. He was accused of protecting terrorists and foreign Jews. By the time he was forced to leave, his small, semi-legal operation had directly assisted in the escape of over 2,000 people. He had gone far beyond his original mission, saving not just the famous names on his list, but hundreds of others who had nowhere else to turn. He was one of the first Americans to witness the policies of the new regime in Europe and tried to warn the world, but his reports were largely ignored back home. What secret communication channels did Fry's committee used to get money and messages from the United States into occupied France? How many of his local French volunteers were later arrested and executed by the Vichy or German authorities? And did the U.S. State Department actively try to shut down his operation? And what evidence of this exists in declassified documents? Number 6, can you rescue an army that doesn't want to be rescued? In late October 1944, in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, one of the most controversial rescue missions of the war took place. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Texas Division, had advanced too far, too fast. They became cut off from the rest of the American army, surrounded by German forces. They were trapped on a wooded ridge, low on food, water, and ammunition, and taking heavy casualties. They became known as the Lost Battalion. Several attempts by other units of the 36th Division to break through and rescue them failed, with heavy losses. After 6 days of isolation, the situation was desperate. The High Command then called upon the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd was a unique unit. It was composed almost entirely of Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans. Many of them had families who were being held in internment camps back in the United States. They had volunteered to fight for a country that was treating their families as potential enemies. The 442nd had a reputation for being one of the toughest and most determined units in the U.S. Army. Their motto was, "Go for broke." They were pulled from a rest area in order to do what 2 other regiments had failed to do, rescue the Lost Battalion. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal of the European campaign. The weather was cold and wet. The forest was dense, with thick fog that limited visibility. The German defenders were well entrenched and determined. The 442nd had to advance up steep, muddy slopes against intense machine gun and artillery fire. The fighting was at close quarters, often tree to tree. The casualty rate was horrific. For 5 days, the Nisei soldiers threw themselves against the German lines. They made a series of frontal assaults, including a near-suicidal banzai charge that finally broke the German defenses. On October 30th, 1944, they broke through and reached the survivors of the Lost Battalion. They had rescued 211 men. The cost of the rescue was staggering. In order to save those 211 men, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, men killed or wounded. In some companies, there were only a handful of soldiers left who could still fight. The number of casualties was almost 4 times the number of men they rescued. The story is documented in books like Go for Broke, a Pictorial History of the Japanese-American 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442d Regimental Combat Team. The mission was a success. The Lost Battalion was saved, but the immense cost has been debated ever since. Some have argued that the commanders were reckless with the lives of the Nisei soldiers, sending them on a mission that others had deemed impossible. But for the men of the 442nd, it was a matter of honor. They were asked to do a job, and they did it, proving their loyalty in the most profound way possible. They became the most decorated unit of their size and length of service in American military history. Were there alternative plans considered for the rescue, such as an airdrop of supplies to allow the battalion to hold out longer, and why were they rejected? How did the soldiers of the Texas Division react to being rescued by Japanese-American soldiers, and were there official reports on the interactions between the 2 units? What was the exact content of the after-action reports filed by the commanders of the 442nd, and did they formally protest the high casualty rate? Number 5, how do you evacuate nurses from a falling fortress? When the Philippines fell to Japanese forces in early 1942, the American and Filipino soldiers who surrendered were forced into the infamous Bataan Death March. But there was another group of Americans trapped on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor, the Angles of Bataan. They were a group of about 100 U.S. Army and Navy nurses. These women had been working in makeshift, open-air hospitals, dealing with a constant stream of wounded soldiers. They were short on medicine, food, and basic supplies. They endured daily bombings and the spread of diseases like malaria and dysentery. As the military situation collapsed, they were ordered to retreat from Bataan to the supposed safety of the Malinta Tunnel Hospital complex on Corregidor. This Corregidor was the last pocket of resistance, but it was also a trap. The island was under constant artillery and air bombardment. It was clear that it too would eventually fall. The high command, including General Douglas MacArthur, who had already been evacuated, was determined not to let the nurses be captured. The fear was that they would be mistreated or used as propaganda by the enemy. A secret, high-stakes rescue mission was planned. The rescue was not a single dramatic raid. It was a series of daring, piecemeal evacuations by air and by sea. The problem was that Corregidor was surrounded. The only way out was on one of the few remaining aircraft or submarines that could brave the Japanese blockade. The missions were incredibly risky. The first group of nurses was evacuated in late April on a PBY Catalina flying boat. The plane had to land in the dark in Manila Bay, which was controlled by the enemy, pick up the nurses, and take off again without being detected. According to Elizabeth M. Norman's book, We Band of Angels, the nurses were chosen by drawing lots. The largest group escaped on the submarine USS Spearfish on the night of May 3rd, 1942. Getting the nurses to the submarine was an operation in itself. They had to be transported in darkness to a designated rendezvous point on the coast of the island. They carried only what they could fit in a single bag. They boarded small boats that took them out to the waiting submarine. The entire operation had to be done in complete silence to avoid alerting the Japanese patrols. Just 3 days after the Spearfish slipped away, Corregidor surrendered. Not all the nurses were rescued. A small group was left behind on Corregidor. They were captured and spent the next 3 years in the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. But the mission to save the majority was a success against all odds. It was a testament to the skill of the pilots and submariners who risked everything to get them out. It was a rescue that prioritized the safety of medical personnel who had served so bravely under fire. Were there secret communications between MacArthur's headquarters in Australia and the nurses on Corregidor that have never been declassified? What happened to the Filipino nurses who worked alongside the Americans and were not included in the evacuation plans? Did any of the pilots or submarine captains involved face official reprimands for taking risks that went against standard operating procedure? Number 4. How do you climb a mountain to rescue a dictator? In the summer of 1943, Italy was in chaos. Allied forces had invaded Sicily, and Italy's fascist Grand Council had voted to remove the dictator, Benito Mussolini, from power. He was arrested and imprisoned. This was a major blow to Germany, Italy's main ally. The German leader was determined to rescue Mussolini and reinstall him as the head of a new puppet state in northern Italy. The problem was finding him. The Italians were moving Mussolini from place to place to prevent any rescue attempt. German intelligence worked frantically to locate him. Eventually, they pinpointed his location, the Campo Imperatore Hotel, a ski resort high in the Apennine Mountains. It was a natural fortress accessible only by, a single cable car. Landing a traditional military force there was impossible. The rescue mission, codenamed Operation Oak Unternehmen Ike, was given to a special unit of German paratroopers and a Waffen-SS commando named Otto Skorzeny, who became the face of the operation. The plan they devised was incredibly audacious. They would land troops on the small, rocky plateau next to the hotel using military gliders. Gliders are unpowered aircraft. They would be towed near the target and then released to land in silence. It was a one-way trip. The chances of crashing on the unprepared high-altitude terrain were extremely high. On September 12, 1943, the mission was launched. 10 gliders carrying about 90 commandos were released over the Gran Sasso Mountain. One of the gliders crashed, but the others managed to make hard, bumpy landings on the mountainside. Skorzeny and his men scrambled out of the gliders and rushed the hotel. The Italian guards, a force of about 200 carabinieri, were completely taken by surprise. They had been told to resist any rescue attempt, but faced with the sudden appearance of elite German commandos, they surrendered without a single shot being fired. The entire raid on the hotel took only a few minutes. Skorzeny found Mussolini and greeted him with the words, "Deuce, the Fuhrer has sent me to set you free." Now came the second, equally difficult part of the mission, getting Mussolini out. The gliders were wrecked. The cable car station at the bottom of the mountain had been captured by another group of German paratroopers, but driving Mussolini down would be too slow and risky. The plan was to use a Fieseler Storch, a small, light reconnaissance plane that could land and take off in a very short distance. The pilot, Heinrich Gerlach, was a personal pilot to a German general and was known for his skill. He managed to land the small plane on the short, rocky plateau. The plane was only designed for 2 people, but Skorzenny, a large man, insisted on squeezing in alongside Mussolini and the pilot. The overloaded plane struggled to take off. It ran across the plateau, dipped over the edge of the cliff, and then at the last second caught the air and began to climb. They flew to a nearby German-controlled airfield and then on to Vienna. The rescue was a stunning success. It was a perfectly executed special forces operation that became a major propaganda victory for the German regime, as documented in Skorzenny's own memoirs, My Commando Operations. What was the true identity of the German intelligence agent who provided the final crucial tip-off about Mussolini's location? Were there Italian officials at the hotel who had been secretly ordered not to resist a rescue attempt? And what was the backup extraction plan if the small airplane had crashed on takeoff, as it very nearly did? Number 3, how can a distraction save 2,000 people? By February 1945, the war in the Pacific was nearing its end, but for the thousands of Allied civilians held in internment camps in the Philippines, every day was a struggle for survival. At the Los Banos internment camp, located 40 miles southeast of Manila, over 2,100 civilians, mostly Americans, British, and Dutch, including many women and children Dutch, were starving. Their food rations had been cut to almost nothing. The camp guards were becoming increasingly brutal. As American forces advanced on Manila, there was credible intelligence that the camp's commandants were planning to execute all the prisoners. A rescue was needed, and it had to happen fast. The mission fell to the U.S. 11th Airborne Division. The camp was deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by a large number of Japanese troops. A frontal assault was out of the question. It would get the prisoners killed. The plan they developed was one of the most complex and brilliantly coordinated operations of the war. It involved a 3-pronged attack perfectly synchronized. The first prong was a company of paratroopers who would jump directly on the camp. The second was a force of amphibious tractors, Amtraks, that would cross a large lake, Laguna de Bay, and arrive at the camp's edge. The third was a larger ground force that would attack and block Japanese reinforcements. The whole operation depended on surprise and timing. But the key to it all was a fourth element, a group of Filipino guerrillas. The guerrillas had been watching the camp for weeks, gathering intelligence on the guards' routines. They would be responsible for silently neutralizing the guard posts on the perimeter just before the paratroopers landed. On the morning of February 23, 1945, the operation began. At 7 a.m., just as the camp guards were doing their morning calisthenics without their weapons, a flight of C-47 transport planes appeared overhead. The paratroopers of B Company, 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry jumped from a very low altitude of 400 feet to ensure accuracy and minimize their time in the air. As they descended, the Filipino guerrillas and the 11th Airborne's reconnaissance platoon, who had sneaked up to the camp's perimeter, opened fire on the watchtowers and barracks. The surprise was total. The paratroopers landed inside the camp and quickly overwhelmed the stunned guards. At the same time, the 54 Amtraks of the 672nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion came ashore from the lake and crashed through the camp's fences. The internees, who at first thought they were being bombed, were initially confused and terrified. The soldiers had to convince them they were being rescued and herd them towards the waiting Amtraks. Some were too weak to walk and had to be carried. The book The Los Banos Raid by Edwin P. Hoyt provides a minute-by-minute account. The entire operation inside the camp, the landing, the securing of the perimeter, and the loading of over 2,000 civilians took less than an hour. As the Amtraks loaded with the freed prisoners headed back across the lake to safety, the ground forces engaged in heavy fighting to hold off Japanese units that were racing to the scene. The raid was an incredible success. 2,147 internees were rescued. Only 2 soldiers and 2 prisoners died during the operation. It is still studied today as a textbook example of a perfectly planned and executed rescue mission. What were the specific contingency plans if the paratroopers had been dropped in the wrong location due to bad weather? How many of the local Filipino guerrillas who provided the critical intelligence and support were killed in the diversionary attacks and never officially counted as casualties of the raid? And were the camp commandants ever brought to justice specifically for their plan to execute the prisoners? Number 2, how do you rescue 500 men miles behind enemy lines? In January 1945, on the Philippine island of Luzon stood the Cabanatuan prison camp. It held the last survivors of the Bataan Death March over 500 American and Allied prisoners of war. For 3 years, they had endured starvation, disease, and brutal treatment. Now, as American forces retook the Philippines, their lives were in greater danger than ever. A captured enemy directive ordered that all prisoners were to be executed if American forces came close. The clock was ticking. A rescue mission was the only option, but it seemed impossible. The camp was 30 miles deep in enemy-held territory. Any rescue force would have to march through the jungle, cross rivers, and avoid thousands of Japanese troops. And the prisoners themselves were in terrible physical condition, too weak to march or run. The mission was given to the 6th Ranger Battalion, an elite U.S. Army unit led by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci. The plan was developed by his executive officer, Captain Robert Prince. It was a plan that relied on daring, secrecy, and the crucial help of local Filipino guerrillas. A force of just over 120, Rangers would sneak behind enemy lines. They would be supported by a group of Alamo Scouts, a small reconnaissance team, and hundreds of Filipino resistance fighters led by Captains Juan Pajota and Eduardo Josan. The mission began on January 28, 1945. The Rangers and Scouts began their long march, moving mostly at night. The Filipino guerrillas provided intelligence, acted as guides, and secured the route. They also had a critical job on the night of the raid. They were to set up roadblocks on the main roads to ambush and hold off any Japanese reinforcements. The biggest tactical problem was the final approach to the camp. The surrounding terrain was flat and open. A daytime attack was suicidal. The plan was for a night attack, but even then, getting close without being seen seemed impossible. This is where Captain Prince came up with a stroke of genius. He requested a night fighter plane, a P-61 Black Widow, to fly over the camp at the exact moment of the attack. The idea was that the plane's engine noise would distract the guards, drawing their attention to the sky while the Rangers crawled across the open field on their bellies. On the evening of January 30th, the plan went into action. As the P-61 began to buzz the camp, the Rangers slithered the last few hundred yards to the camp's fence. At 7:45 p.m., the firing started. The Rangers hit the front and back gates simultaneously, overwhelming the guards in a swift, coordinated assault that lasted less than 30 minutes. Getting the prisoners out was the next challenge. Many were so weak they couldn't believe they were being rescued. Some had to be carried. The Filipino villagers had assembled a caravan of ox-drawn carts to transport the weakest men. As the Rangers and freed prisoners began the long journey back to American lines, Captain Pajota's guerrillas fought a fierce battle at the Kabu River Bridge, holding off a large Japanese relief force and preventing them from attacking the slow-moving column. Hampton Sides' book, Ghost Soldiers, vividly describes the entire operation. The Great Raid, as it came to be known, was a spectacular success. It was a mission that succeeded because of meticulous planning, perfect execution, and the indispensable courage of the Filipino resistance. What would have happened if the P-61 pilot had been shot down or had failed to show up at the precise moment? How many undocumented local Filipinos risked their lives to guide the Rangers and provide the ox carts, and were they ever compensated or recognized? Were there any specific written plans for what the Rangers were to do if they reached the camp and found that the prisoners had already been executed? Number 1, what does it take to stop a war for one man? This is the story of a rescue that didn't involve a single soldier, but a team of doctors. In the spring of 1944, a young man named Eddie Mizzi, a Maltese national, was working for the British in Naples, Italy. He contracted polio, the disease was aggressive, he was completely paralyzed, and his lungs were failing. The only thing keeping him alive was an iron lung, a large metal tank that breathed for him. There were only 2 iron lungs in all of southern Italy. At the same time, the battle for Monte Cassino was raging a few miles to the north. It was one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the Italian campaign. The town and the ancient monastery on the mountaintop were being pounded into rubble. The front line was a place of constant, intense combat. The problem was that the power supply in Naples was unreliable. The frequent power cuts caused by the fighting threatened to shut down Eddie's iron lung. If that happened, he would die in minutes. His doctors knew that the only place with a stable, uninterrupted power supply was the 300th General Hospital, a large American medical facility. But it was on the other side of the front line, in German-occupied Rome. What followed was one of the most surreal rescue missions of the war. Eddie's British doctor contacted the International Red Cross. The Red Cross, in turn, brokered an incredible agreement. The German and Allied high commands agreed to a temporary, local ceasefire. They would stop the war, just for a few hours, along a specific route, to allow an ambulance to carry one sick man through the front line. The story, documented in articles like a 2004 piece in the British Medical Journal by a relative of Mizzi, seems almost unbelievable. On May 21st, 1944, a British ambulance set out from Naples. It carried Eddie, his iron lung, a doctor, and a team of nurses and technicians. As it approached the front line, the shelling and shooting stopped. The ambulance, marked with Red Cross flags, crossed into no man's land. It passed by German soldiers in their trenches, who watched it go by. The ambulance then met a German military vehicle. The German army had agreed to provide an escort to ensure its safe passage through their lines. The strange little convoy then drove north, through the German rear areas, all the way to Rome. They arrived safely at the American hospital, which had been left to operate under German supervision. Eddie Mizzi was transferred to their care. The mission was a success. For a few hours on a small stretch of road, two armies that were doing everything in their power to destroy each other agreed to stop, all to save the life of one civilian. And Eddie Mizzi survived the war. He lived in the iron lung for another 14 years. His rescue is a little-known story, a tiny footnote in the history of a massive conflict. It involved no commandos, no spies, and no weapons. It was a mission that succeeded because, even in the midst of total war, a few people were able to appeal to a shared sense of humanity. What were the exact names of the German and Allied field commanders who had to approve this unprecedented local ceasefire? Were there any recorded instances of the ceasefire being violated, even by a single shot, during the ambulance's transit? And what were the internal discussions like at the German high command in Italy when they received this bizarre request from the Red Cross?